Dear fellow Donne scholars, I have the great pleasure to welcome you to this first ever John Donne Society webinar. I'm very happy to see such a lovely crowd of old friends and new friends, of seasoned scholars as well as young starting researchers and teachers, and from all around Earth's imagined corners. I hope you will enjoy the program. While I get to wish you welcome, I must hasten to acknowledge the people who really have made this happen, the creative and technical heart of our webinar team. That would be Arno Zimmern, Brent Nelson and Greg Neidel, as well as Thea Gerbeza, and our speakers, whom I will introduce separately in a moment. With this combination of technical skills and scholarship, they are here to add a new way for us to experience the magic of Donne. It is, however, not without some sadness and resignation that I open this event. The reason that we have postponed the 36th John Donne Society Conference of February 2021, and why we are meeting like this, online and at a great distance, is that we have not yet been able to defeat the horrific pandemic that is plaguing our world, all of our world. Some of you may have suffered through the illness yourselves, or seen others suffer. Others may have lost friends or loved ones. There is hope on the horizon, but there are still months to go, and in so many ways, the world will probably never be quite the same again. But we do have the great privilege to work with a writer like John Donne, who had also certainly seen his share of suffering and pain. He lived in a world of persecution and fear, as well as sickness and death. At the same time, Donne concluded that no man is an island. We are all part of a community, and we can support one another. I hope that this webinar can be our way to conquer and to show that as scholars, we are the meridians crossing parallels. We can meet like this, defying social distancing and isolation, and we will prevail. The theme of this, our first webinar, is Teaching Donne in Emergent Occasions. In addition, for us to meet around our beloved poet and preacher and his text, the aim here is also to share ways in which we can make Donne ever more relevant for our students today, and especially in these trying times. So, let me introduce our speakers. I'll introduce all three speakers and then give over to them. First, our panel chair, Professor Michael Schoenfeldt. Professor Schoenfeldt is the John Knott Professor of English Literature at the University of Michigan. He's the author of, for example, Prayer and Power, George Herbert and Renaissance Courtship of 1991, and the Cambridge Introduction to Shakespeare's Poetry of 2010, as well as editor of John Donne in Context of 2019. Professor Schoenfeldt is currently writing a book for Cambridge University Press entitled Reading John Donne, and he's the second vice president of the John Donne Society. Professor Mary Papazian serves as president and professor of English at San Jose State University. She's the author of numerous essays on Donne with a focus on the devotions upon emergent occasions and on Donne's religious poetry. And she's the editor of John Donne and the Protestant Reformation, 2003, and The Sacred and Profane in English Renaissance Literature, 2008. She was a contributing commentary editor to the Songs and Sonnets volume of Donne Variorum, and she's a past president of the John Donne Society. Professor Sean McDowell is Associate Professor of English and Director of the University Honors Program at Seattle University, and he's Executive Director and First Vice President of the John Donne Society. He has published a great number of essays on Donne and his contemporaries, as well as on modern Irish and American poets. In addition to working on the Verse Letters and Divine Poems volumes of the Donne Variorum, he's the editor of the John Donne Journal. His book, Metaphysical Shadows, The Persistence of Donne, Herbert, Crashaw, Vaughan, and Marvell in Contemporary Poetry, is forthcoming from Lexington Books. Professor McDowell's own poetry has appeared in the United States, England, Wales, Ireland, Greece, and Australia. I'm thrilled to see these three scholars on our first webinar program panel. And so now, without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Schoenfeldt. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria, for that lovely introduction and that lovely citing of this special event that I hope we're not doing in 5 years. Let me say that. I want to say thanks to Arnaud, Taya, Sean, and just this amazing community of those of us who love Donne. This ain't Baton Rouge, but I'll take it. You're a sight for sore, bored eyes. And in my brief time today, I want to consider what it's like to read and teach Donne's devotions amid our own thoroughly emergent occasion, the COVID pandemic. I was lucky enough this semester to be teaching a virtual graduate course on John Donne with 6 brilliant, patient graduate students. On 3 different continents, we endured not a breach, but an expansion in our myriad discussions. In our weekly meetings, moreover, not unlike this occasion, we found real comfort in communal immersion in Donne's rich and challenging works. We were continually struck, moreover, by the ways that Donne's effort to make sense of his own diseased and divisive time had acquired resonance in our own anxious moment. Confined for the most part to our domiciles, we read with added poignancy Donne's wish to make one little room and everywhere. It is perhaps not surprising that the devotions, written during an epidemic throughout London of what was most likely typhus, would speak with particular power to our own moment. Donne's full title is Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions and Several Steps in My Sickness, published in 1624 on the heels of a devastating illness that Donne experienced in late 1623. The work is divided into 23 sections which correspond to the 23 days of the poet's illness, and each of these is further subdivided, as you all know, into 3 parts. Donne seems to have found some comfort in the narrative and numerical ordering of his disease, as if one could discover a formal liturgy of spiritual and physical progress amid the indiscriminate behavior of bacteria. Now, almost 400 years after Donne's illness, we are particularly well positioned by our own damned virus to appreciate the copious poetry of affliction that suffuses the devotions. The disease not only afflicts Donne's body, but also imposes a hermeneutic burden on his mind and soul. Donne describes the sores that erupt all over his body as the letters in which thou, God, has written thine own name and conveyed thyself to me. Much of the work is devoted to the effort to interpret such symptoms as a message from God. And for Donne, the fact that they are written in a largely indecipherable alphabet on his body only increases the urgency. So there's something really familiar and something uncannily strange in Donne's overall project of translating the experience of being colonized by typhus into a coherent narrative of the will of an omnipotent deity. Devotion 2 has a fascinating account of the senses failing, something we hear with COVID to a fault, it seems. In the twinkling of an eye, I can scarce see. Instantly, the taste is insipid and fatuous. Instantly, the appetite is dull and desireless. Instantly, the knees are sinking and strengthless. The physical symptoms that Donne experiences, high fever, chills, cough, rash, dizziness, weakness, are repeatedly likened to natural disasters. Earthquakes in himself, sudden shakings, lightnings, sudden flashes, thunder, sudden noises, eclipses, sudden offuscations, and darkenings of his senses. Donne is subjected to many of the so-called remedies of the time. In a particularly striking passage, dead pigeons are placed on his feet to draw the ill humors down from his head, a therapy that was likely the hydroxychloroquine of early modern physiology. Of course, more traditional remedies were used as well, such as cupping, bleeding, and purgatives, many of which were so invasive and unpleasant they could make the patient briefly forget the original affliction. And something must have worked, as Donne lived for another 8 years. Donne experiences some all too familiar aspects of living through an epidemic. He has terrible insomnia, wondering, why is none of the heaviness of my head dispensed into mine eyelids? I don't know about you, but I know the feeling. He also experiences a torturous sense of isolation. Even amid his horrible physical suffering, what Donne finds most agonizing is the solitude imposed by his illness. As sickness is the greatest misery, Donne writes, so the greatest misery of sickness is solitude. Solitude is a torment which is not threatened in hell itself. As we all know, illness and the threat of contagion can be terribly isolating. In the devotions, Donne not only describes his tortured solitude, but also shows how one can narrate oneself back into sociality. I've often wondered why Donne chose, in the midst of a devastating disease, to expend precious energy to write at all. And I've also wondered why Donne, typically so allergic to publication, chose to publish the work. I think both actions can be understood as urgent claims on the healing sociality he insistently missed. They are efforts to repair what he calls in the ecstasy defects of loneliness. This harrowing account of the agonies of solitary confinement supplies the other side of Donne's passionate sense of human interconnectedness, best expressed in those all too famous lines from the devotions, which I would argue are rendered even more resonant and meaningful in our current moment. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Boy, that's fun to read. Humans, Donne suggests, may look like an archipelago, but we are in fact a profoundly interconnected landmass. True individuality, this most individual of writers declares, is an illusion. Tellingly, Donne's sonorous expression of the profound interconnectedness of humanity is not limited to those who abide by the liturgy of the Church of England, or even to those who inhabit the actual island that is the United Kingdom. Although the passage begins with baptism into the body of Christian believers, it concludes with a bold statement of the inevitably peninsular relation of all humans, celebrating our myriad contiguities and tacit interdependencies. Throughout his career, Donne is fascinated by such unacknowledged connections and unexpected relations. His poetry and prose are marked by startling moments of electrifying connections between people, between objects, between people and objects, and between heaven and earth. Indeed, it is this mode of perception which underpins the famous notion of the metaphysical conceit. This discerning sense of human interconnectedness led Donne to a surprisingly profound concern for the poor in Meditation 7, not something I think of going to Donne for necessarily. This is a passage I'd read many times, but it never caught my attention amid the verbal fireworks of the other passages. But at this moment, when the pandemic has thrown into relief the devastating inequities of our dispensation of medical treatment, this passage was suddenly incandescent. The fact that Donne's physician desires to have others joined with him in the treatment of Donne leads Donne to wonder about those who are far less privileged than he. How many are sicker, perchance, he wonders, than I, laid on their woeful straw at home, if that corner be a home, and have no more hope of help, though they die, than of preferment, though they live? How many are sicker, perchance, than I, and thrown into hospitals where, as a fish, left upon the sand must stay the tide. They must stay the physician's hour of visiting, and then can be but visited. In this remarkable passage, which goes on further, but Donne shows a profound awareness for his belated privilege and a welcome recognition that an army of royal doctors is not available to most patients. The brutal reign of the coronavirus has made us acutely conscious of our own excruciating vulnerability. We should never forget that health, then and now, is at best a precious but fragile fiction that will someday abandon us if it is not already. Donne describes how the disease came upon him suddenly at the speed of English syntax. This minute I was well and am ill this minute. As Donne writes in the first anniversary, there is no health. Physicians say that we at best enjoy but neutrality. As Donne knew all too well, we are always in some state of disease, whether we know it or not. The essential hermeneutic project of the work is revealed clearly in Prayer 7. Let me think no degree of this thy correction casual or without signification. The Devotions is a book desperately suffused with the effort to elicit signification from suffering, finding metaphors in every symptom or fevered sensation. As we deal with the widespread suffering of our pandemic, we should perhaps remember that if Donne had not experienced this terrible illness, we would not have the aesthetic jewel that is the Devotions. Perhaps someone in our culture will similarly metabolize the agonies of COVID into glories resembling those of the devotions. But I would not hold my breath. Thanks.
Hang on one second. That was wonderful, Michael. And I just, first, it's great to see everyone. It's been far too long, and you indulge a rusty academic who spent too many of the past years in administration. And so we don't usually get to talk about poetry in quite this way. And in our prep call, Michael said he was just going to chat a little bit about Donne and make it very informal. And of course, he's just given us a wonderfully polished and beautiful reading that touches on so many of the issues that I think resonate with all of us. So let me just, in the interest of, I'm not trying to figure out what new I have to add to that, Michael. I thought I had a few ideas here, but let me just put out here what I've put on some slides just to help myself, less so to help you, and just perhaps offer a few thoughts on. Let me just figure out how to do this. Yeah, so Maria asked me to do this, and I thought it's been a long time. I think about Donne and the devotions and the poetry a lot, but I don't study it in the same way, and I've missed it tremendously. And so clearly in the course of this pandemic, there are so many issues and so many experiences, and I think it's the experiential and the emotional side of it that really resonates. And I started to ask myself, what are some of these questions that come to bear? And I think, how could the experience of Donne's persona inform the experiences of those afflicted by COVID-19? We really have multiple levels of I think, order here. There's the perspective of the work as a whole and the devotions. When we step back and we see the overarching narrative and structure, we know the outcome, that he recovered. And yet here we are in the midst of a pandemic. We can begin to see that there's hope at the end, right? We are seeing the results of vaccines, that they're starting very slowly to filter out. And so we believe that in the long run, we will all be okay, or at least collectively we will be okay. What we don't know, though, is individually whether or not we will be okay. And this is really putting ourselves in the minds and the perspective of Donne himself while he's narrating his own experience, trying to create that sense of immediacy, looking back, but trying to create a real presence. And as we think about where we are, we see that overall archingness. March, we all pivoted, we went virtual, we thought it would get better, sort of stabilized a little bit, but then it all became worse. And now we're moving into the dark days, right at the darkest time of year. There's something I think very poetic that Donne would have enjoyed about that, moving into sometimes some of the worst numbers, certainly here in the United States, though it might look different elsewhere, at the time of the darkest days of all. And so we will emerge from this as light begins to grow. And so I think about how Donne helps us really understand and feel what people are going through today. So where are the links, and where are some important differences? What is it that ultimately allows Donne, through each of the devotions, individually, to go through a process, particularly in the expostulations, where the first half is really worrisome and he looks like he's heading to despair, and then something right in the middle of each expostulation turns and he returns to a comfort and is able then to conclude that devotion in prayer. Can the devotions bring us comfort here in the 21st century? How does it really allow us to see purpose and meaning behind things that sometimes seem very random and that we experience? Does Donne's depiction of his emotional state during the various phases reflect those of sufferers of COVID-19? Now, I haven't been close to them, but I know some of you have. And we read those accounts and some of those most personal accounts of those experiences. And really, it goes back to the differences. How does Donne's theological frame really help us understand what allowed him to get through it, and what can we learn from that? What is it that we bring, each of us, whether it's faith-based or in some other way, that allows us also to find some comfort? So I started to think about what some of the key topics, and we've all talked about these collectively over the years in many, many ways. What part of this is meditation? When do we return to that meditative state, particularly in the meditative parts of each of these 23 devotions? And how much is this really, in Donne's case, an account of his own spiritual autobiography, where his belief comes in, where his faith comes in, how it allows him to move from that fear and that suffering and that sense of almost being lost to finding and being able to place his hope in something else. The overall narrative structure against each devotion cycle. The overall structure is a literal, or it seems to be, course of a disease, but each devotion cycle is an emotional experience that recurs. He finds some peace. He moves into the next phase, the next incident, the next occasion that causes fear again and back. And how to interpret it, as Michael referenced, with affliction and correction. These are really, I think, part of what make this seemingly prose piece much more poetic, and I think much more linked to Donne's poetry. I always get stuck on the physicians a little bit, and in reading this and thinking about how it impacts the pandemic today, I think about a lot about how we put so much faith in these knowledgeable scientists, and yet in many cases, they're just making their way through as well. Donne's physicians, they may have come from the royal court, but they too didn't really know how to cure typhus. And I would say that many of our physicians, remarkable scientists doing extraordinary work, also struggled. And so we saw more deaths, if you will, in the first part of the pandemic, back in March and April and May, than we're seeing now in the same way, because the interventions have become more known. They are learning along the way. And just this idea of solitude and isolation. Again, Donne's always, going within himself, which creates the solitude, and then looking to connect outside. I've really come to speak not of social distancing, but of physical distancing. We are physically distant right now, just as Donne was physically apart from the world outside him, but he wasn't socially distant. And he found ways to make that emotional connection. Just a quick run. Many of you have heard me speak of this many years ago, but I do see that there's a pattern in the episode, the broader narration, which provides that broad frame, the clustering of devotions. And so there really are two levels of structure here, the broader structure, but within it, the cycle of each devotion. And I won't spend much time on this. You all know this, but I think thinking about particularly episode 4, what I call, some of those passages with the most famous lines of "No man is an island" that Michael read, that sleeplessness. I don't know if any of you noticed that, but this pattern of waking up at 3 a.m. today is actually a pattern. And it is happening everywhere. People are reporting it over and over again. It seems to be a consequence of this pandemic, of being in this phase, of some level of anxiety that's working beneath the surface that impacts all of us. And then even when the crisis passes for Donne and the cures seem to work and he rises from his bed, is he really at peace? And I think there's a real question to be said. And what will our peace be like when we reach that point in the devotions, when we reach that point in our lives, when this pandemic is over, when we've reached herd immunity, 70% of the population having been vaccinated, right? That's a big number. Will we too be able to return to the kind of peace? Will we just forget this experience, or will it linger in our consciousness in a way that I think Donne's experiences did linger in his, even after he was well? I just highlighting here just a few passages that really jumped out at me. There are so many more, but this idea of sickness as the great misery and sickness being a sign of solitude. But when we think about this pandemic, COVID-19, and its infectiousness, it's even more insidious than the typhus, I think, that Donne experienced, because it's passing amongst us asymptomatically. We don't know where the harm is. We don't know how we're getting it if we are. It is everywhere. And so that sense of isolation is even greater because we now have to separate from people who seem well. We may be spreaders of things, and we may be putting others at risk without even knowing we are. And so I think this concept of infectiousness was one that really impacted Donne, and I think is profound for us. Solitude is a torment which is not threatened in hell itself. It is worse than hell. It is something even more powerful. And yet, what are we all doing right now? We are quarantining. For those of us here in the United States who celebrate Thanksgiving, how many of us had the smallest Thanksgiving we ever had? I know I made the smallest turkey I'd ever made. And we had Zoom calls with other people, with other family members, in order to feel that sense of connection. But notice this, Donne seeing, and I think this is characteristic in the devotions. There's something, because Donne is a believer and has faith in his own election, if you will, his own having received the grace of God, that he knows that when he dies, he will be in peace and he will not be infecting anymore. So this sense of being in this world, being sick, where the body might infect, is a worse curse in some ways than being dead, where you bury the sickness with you. And so again, he is in solitude, but he is worrying about others. Because what is the worry of infection? You're already sick. It's not about you. It's about others. And I think there's a profound empathy here in the devotions that comes through in lines like this. It almost seems as if he's turning it on himself, but I always saw it as Donne seeing here how it impacts others and being able to pull himself out of himself. Another one I really thought about, because I think it meets the moment, is this sense of comfort or fear. Where are we finding comfort, and how are we experiencing fear? And there is this level of fear that just undergirds within anxiety the devotions as a whole. We see it from beginning, variable and therefore miserable condition of man, in the first lines, all the way to the end, when it looks like he's trying to come to peace at the very, very end, and all he's talking about is a fear of relapsing and falling back into sickness and sin. And so he sees, and again, think about how we put our faith in experts, right? We put our faith in Tony Fauci, right? We put our faith in those physicians. And he did the same in the devotions. I observed the physicians with the same diligence as he the disease. But notice what he notices about the physician. And Donne was ever the perceptive viewer and understander of people, of those, if you will, those nonverbals, those things that are under the surface. And what does he see? He sees in the physician fear that the physician is trying so hard to hide. And how many times have we seen that? How many can we imagine thinking about those images of physicians today that we see in the ICUs, and of the nurses who are in the ICUs? And look what they're wearing, right? They're all with their PPE, their personal protective equipment, the shields and the masks and the gowns, and this sense that they are afraid. Why are they wearing it? So they don't become sick. Right? So they don't become ill. But there's also the sense, do we really understand how to treat this? And Donne's physician went through the same thing. And this is what Donne tells us. He said, I overtake him, I overrun him in his fear, but I fear the more. Why? Not because of my own sickness, but because he disguises his fear. Because he is trying to make it seem better for me, but he knows that ultimately he may not be able to help me. And I think we're seeing that. And as we empathize with all of our first responders, all of our healthcare workers who are trying to take care of us, that they too are going through this fear, and they've pushed it back because they are professionals. They are empathetic healthcare workers who care about the health of their patients. But we should never forget, and Donne doesn't let us, that we need to be empathetic to what they're feeling. And I'm sure many of you have read some of those stories of these healthcare providers, particularly in the early days, returning home. And this is when we still thought COVID-19 spread on surfaces, before we fully understood the aerial nature of it. Taking off their clothes, putting them in the washer, making sure they removed all signs of infection so that they wouldn't infect their own families. And so Donne sees this, and I think it's something that reminds us of this, again, this human empathy that he has. And again, a little bit more on fear. This is really kind of placing it now in Donne's faith, which I think is really important here, because that faith in something that he has ultimately, I think, gives him the power and the ability to place himself in someone else's care. And that humility, I think, ultimately is what allows him to move through the affliction. And so, as he says, I lie here possessed with that fear, which is thy fear, both that this sickness is thy immediate correction and not merely a natural accident. This is Donne's need to find purpose and meaning in the experience itself. And how many times do we try to do the same, to find purpose and meaning? Donne locates it, of course, in God's wishes for him. In the devotions, he talks about, Donne trying to, that his own not finding secular employment, but being held out for the church was God's wish for him. And so therefore he is fearful, because it is a fearful thing to fall into thy hands. But that very fear actually is what brings him comfort. So in this sense, fear and comfort are really two sides of the same coin. They go together, because by fearing God, he knows that that is a sign of grace, and that means that he will never fall out of God's hands. And then I think this longing for release from it, really allowing himself at the end of prayer 18 to be swallowed up in eternity, really in those moments of crisis, looking for that end and hoping for that peace that is probably, I think, the most exuberant and joyful passage in the entire devotions. This is the moment when he thinks he's conquered it, when he's going to move past the bodily sickness, the trials and tribulations of this world that will never end. But that's not God's plan for him. And of course, he returns back. And now in those last two devotions, 22 and 23, I think, which lead to that open-ended conclusion, that lament again of the impact of original sin, the nature of the human condition. And if we think about what we're seeing around us, as we hope to move to peace and to cure and to putting this all behind us, what really will come next? Will there be another pandemic? Will there be more suffering? And we know ultimately that there probably will, because, as Donne reminds us here, that is the nature of this world. So what do we have at the end? How satisfying ultimately is Donne's conclusion? And where does it leave us? Hoping to return to normalcy. I think we feel a nuanced sense that he has expressed the turbulence of emotions that we've all gone through. But without the faith that Donne brings to the table, where do we go from here? And I'll just leave it there with an open question. Where do we go from here?
Thank you, Mary. That was great. You actually hear my my applause. No, I love the idea of looking at what you can glean from the devotions in the present moment, and especially the affective work that happens, the emotional work, and how we nuance that. I'm going to be speaking to. First of all, I have to show you that I've got one of the official John Donne Society measuring little hourglasses here, so I keep myself on task just so we know that's how it is. I've been asked to speak today about the poems that issue from illness, and about how we might look at Donne's poems as invitations to write ourselves, or as invitations for our students to write. So I'll pull up a PowerPoint here in a moment. Bear with me. My laptop is a university issued, so it sometimes is a little bit slow. Anyway, does everybody see that? So Donne's hymns in particular as invitations to write. And what I like to speak about in a few minutes is just the ways in which maybe we can see in Donne's poems opportunities for our students and ourselves in expressing what we're going through during this pandemic, and in seeing maybe a way to put students into a new relationship with the poems that they study. So as you know, the devotions is certainly one of Donne's powerful responses to illness, but also we can see that there are at least two poems too that the scholarly consensus ties to periods of Donne's illness. The first, of course, is Hymn to God, My God, in My Sickness, which has been associated by Walton with Donne's final illness. Walton gives it a date of March 23rd, 1630. It would be 1631 by our calendar reckoning. Also, there is another witness in the state papers of Sir Julius Caesar that places this poem at an earlier date with the earlier illness. This is based on a rapper that rapped the original draft of the poem in Sir Julius Caesar's handwriting, and he dates it, Dr. Donne, Dean of St. Paul's, his verses in his great sickness in December 1623. So this poem, regardless of which of these we seem to follow, most I think would agree with the 1623 dating based on B18. Donne wrote this poem as issuing from illness, much the way he wrote the devotions. The other poem that frequently comes up in this context is, of course, the Hymn to God the Father. Now, the Donne Variorum edition is going to print this poem as two different versions, one coming from the 1633 edition, the other one coming from the manuscript DT1. You see it as a different title there. It's got a different title of Hymn to God the Father and to Christ. And of course, the datings for this could be either, the scholarly consensus seems to be either, it could be a poem coming in the aftermath of passing of Donne's wife, or as a result of the 1623 illness, or 1630. A lot of people, I think, would see this poem as somewhat fitting with the 1623 illness. The point is that the pressures of illness seem to have also forced Donne into writing these poems, and I think we can see here an opportunity for us during this current pandemic circumstance. So poems as invitations to write. Oftentimes when we're teaching poems in literature classes, we are analyzing them, we are interpreting them, we're trying to determine what they mean in their historical circumstances in our present. But another way of looking at the poems is a way that's in accordance with what Donne and his contemporaries would have seen. That is, poems as ways into their own expression, their own poem making. And I think this perspective is very important in teaching today. The pandemic has really shattered many of our usual ways of teaching. Many of us were forced on very short notice from going to our traditional in-person seminar style, lecture style way of teaching into a fully online or hybrid version. So as soon as you do that, many of your usual givens go out the window. Every course you teach suddenly becomes a brand new prep, and you're dealing with a whole series of variables that a lot of people hadn't had to confront before. Even routine assignments like having students write papers is challenging during this time period because it doesn't seem to be as urgent to write a research paper on an obscure topic in 17th century culture as it once did prior to this pandemic set of circumstances. Meanwhile, students and adults alike are having trouble. We're confronted with simultaneously more time to read and also a greater difficulty in simply reading and in concentrating on any kind of work. This seems to be a factor of the pandemic. So in addition to the teaching impact, there's of course the personal impact. Our students who are going through a profound sense of isolation. Many of the things that came out in Mary's wonderful analysis of the devotions, you can see at play here. A sense that even though Donne might realize no man is an island, no person is an island, we all feel pretty islanded. when we're in our house arrest conditions. The students feel this strongly, at least they did last spring, and they do continue to do so. Of very sociable by nature, they're suddenly deprived of what they came to depend on. For some students, that meant the collapse of their senior years of high school. For others, it meant suddenly being thrust back into their homes again, living in their childhood bedrooms, but somehow expected to do college classes. It's a tremendously hard situation. When I was confronted with this last spring, I decided that I needed to, as part of my adjustments for teaching, I had to adjust what I expected of my students in terms of writing. So I endeavored to put in play some ideas that I developed over the past 15 years in consultation with Washington State Poet Laureate Sam Green, with whom I've taught many times creative writing classes focused in Ireland. And what we used, the strategies we would use to get students to write, many of whom have no aspirations in literary aspirations whatsoever. They're not creative writing majors. They may be from a variety of majors. We are still tasked with trying to get them to write creatively in a very short period of time. So I started using some of these ideas in standard literature courses, particularly the idea that you can teach through what we call, what Sam and I call scaffolds, a scaffolding approach. We all, of course, know what scaffolds are. Here's a scaffold on Notre Dame, which I think was actually part of the problem with the fire. But in this case, the scaffold is simply a temporary structure that helps you build what it is you're trying to build. And our central premise is that any poem, any successful poem, can offer a scaffold for writing other new original poems. So in the few minutes I have remaining, I want to walk you through how that has played out in my teaching, but also how it can play out with Donne's hymns. So in the fall quarter, I taught a course on Greek and Roman literature, and I decided very early on that I would give students opportunities to do some creative writing. This turned out to be the most popular aspect of the course, and the students kept asking for more and more creative writing opportunities, more and more assignments, and it turned into a much bigger thing than I originally intended. So what kinds of things did we do? How does a scaffolding method work? Well, you take a poem that works, and you see how it works. You give your students a structure that they then can follow. So this is a poem I'm going to show you by Annie of Tegea, who has the distinction of being one of the first ancient Greek poets to write epitaphs for animals. Here's a representative poem of hers. A dolphin. No more exulting in the calm seas shall I rise from the depths and thrust through the waves. No more shall I rush past the beautiful prow of a fair row-locked ship delighting in the figurehead. The dark waters of the sea dashed me to land, and I lie here upon this narrow shore. So not many of her poems survive, just under 30 poems of hers we can identify as hers, but she has several of these animal epitaphs, and they all tend to follow a particular pattern. So what we would do to create a scaffold based on this poem is we would identify what are the moves that the poet makes in order to make the poem a poem. This is the biggest challenge for getting students to write creatively. They don't know what to say, that's one problem, but they don't know how to say it. And by giving them a scaffold for how to say it, then they can figure out what they want to say. And this is how the process works. So here's a scaffold based on a dolphin. The title of the poem is very simple. It's just whatever the animal is you're writing about, right? An animal. That's the title. So the first step is, what was the life experience like for this animal? The life or experience like for this animal. Convey this life or experience through two descriptive statements. Just make two statements. That's your first step. Second step, how did this animal meet its end? Answer this question in one statement. And then the third step is, what has been lost as a result of the animal's passing? Or where has the animal gone? Answer either question in one statement. Now, what we would notice in reading the poems, notice that we're reading the poems because we're trying to get, I'm trying to say, okay, we're reading these poems because I want you to write your own poems, which is a different thing than let's interpret the poem, okay? So we would notice, as we talked about these epitaphs, that they all seem to have these three parts, and they could come in any order. So you can mix the orders of these elements, but the poem must have all three. These are my walking papers for students who chose to write this assignment. Okay? So these are some examples of what the students wrote. A sparrow. Never again will your wings smooth the skyline, painting wind trails across summer sunset in a high-speed chase with passing cars. You were mistaken, little bird. Your reflection was not a passing friend, but the glass your body was crushed against. Here's another one about a house cat. Never again will I warm the sagging couch, sleeping without a care on bright Sunday mornings. Never again will I rush through the green grass in pursuit of a nimble fly. I died peacefully from the sting of a needle, surrounded by those I loved. Or here's one, a cricket. You screech and screech in the trees all night long. Noise is your existence. Summer is your mother. I lay with my eyes to the heavens, wishing for your silence, and winter comes. Your legs freeze, frozen in the cold, and still I cannot sleep. So you can see what happens with this scaffold is a variety of things happen with this. The students write very different poems depending on how they interpret the instructions, and that's really what's supposed to happen. You're not trying to write an imitation of an original poem. What you're doing is you're trying to use a poem, a good poem, as a means a way into getting at your own experiences. So what I'll be doing then is after this course ended, several of the students in that course are going to be in another course with me in the winter, and they all said that I had to beef up, not just repeat, but beef up these exercises in a course that I was designing. This course will have a 3.5-week unit on the metaphysical poets. And so I began the challenge of trying to find, again, poems and using poems that would speak to their own experiences or give them a way in. So a hymn to God, and my sickness. You see the poem, this is the B18 version of the poem. It's got some interesting features to it. We won't read the poem here aloud in the interest of time, but you can see it on the handout I posted in the chat. The poem is interesting because it starts out by tasking people's sense of figurative language. It starts with an analogy and then very quickly turns into a conceit of the body as map and the physicians as cosmographers before moving on to its other movements. Here's the second part of the poem. And again, that text of B18 is in the chat. So how would I scaffold a poem like this one? So a scaffold based on sickness. You start out, here's what's interesting about the poem. If you didn't know that Donne was sick, you wouldn't realize that from the body of the poem until we get to the second stanza. So there's a clue in the title that gives the actual situation that the speaker is going through. So you say hymn to whatever you're giving the hymn to, whether it's a deity or it's a force of nature, a person. You can come up with anything for what the hymn is to. And then a phrase describing your situation in real, not metaphorical terms. So what's actually happening to you? You know, you're bereft because you lost someone. You're depressed because it's Monday and you've got to go to class. Whatever the situation is, okay? You can interpret that any way you want. That's how you're supposed to do it. And then you follow through a series of steps. So the first step would be briefly describe your immediate situation through an analogy. So notice that in order to do this step, you got to talk about what kinds of analogies that might work. You have to help students see how an analogy is powerful. The second step here would be to describe yourself in this situation through a conceit. In Donne's poem, he figures his body as a map. I'm a map, and my doctors are cosmographers. And this springboards into other considerations about his ultimate status in the world. Then you ask 3 related questions that emerge from this conceit, and you answer them all in one statement. This is the section of the Donne's poem where he talks about the different straits that he passes through. He asks questions. One leads into the other, but they all tend to have the same answer as he gets to the end of it. Then make one request of your recipient, and then finally describe what your situation would be like if the request were granted. Now notice what happens here once again is the scaffold is not an imitation. What you're trying to do is simply create a temporary structure that allows students to funnel their experiences into it. And it's that funneling of experience that leads to original poems, right? So if you have students follow a procedure like this, there could be many ways of scaffolding this poem actually. You'll see that they can right away launch into a foray of describing their own situations. I've also got a scaffold for To Christ, but in the interest of time, I won't dwell on it too much. I'll just show you what it is. It's in the handout in the chat. This is the DT1 version of To Christ, and we all know this poem very well. This is the variant. This is the version that has as the last line, "I have no more." So some critics have said, okay, there's the pun on and done more, right? So here's a scaffold based on To Christ. You can see it. It's going to be in the handout in your chat. Notice it's the same sort of thing. You ask students to do specific things, write questions, give them some rules. The rules can become completely arbitrary so long as they push students forward in being able to express something. So you can see this this scaffold is in the chat, and we can talk about it during the break of discussion if you wish. But I want to end with some rules for using this kind of scaffolding approach. So if you're using these scaffolds, right, these are some helpful tips I've given students over the years with Donne poems especially. Donne poems are very hard to scaffold compared to others, but they can be very rewarding. I had students several years ago do a poems based on the Good Morrow, and they did a wonderful job. So sometimes students will have trouble writing, and they don't see themselves as creative. They're science majors or something. They just can't see themselves as doing this. You can teach them the little trick that Ben Jonson or Gates or many others would do, is to write in prose first. Just get ideas down on paper and then have them channel it into a structure. That is something we found to be helpful. Or when writing the poem, it's important that you tell students that they should not, once you've got a scaffold in here, do not look at the original poem upon which a scaffold is based. If you have the students still looking at the original poem past a certain point, what they'll do is they'll try to replicate the syntax and wording of the original, but these are not their own, right? Find your subject in your own voice, just as the students in the dolphin scaffold did. The principle that thought governs line and not vice versa is something I think many of us just teach in our literature classes, generally speaking. But students have a lot of trouble with this, especially if they start trying to rhyme. As soon as you have students starting to rhyme poems, they steer all their lines toward the rhymes, and it's a nightmare. So it's usually best on these first drafts to discourage them from using rhymes. Any scaffold that you make from any poem is simply a frame for one's material. It is not an end unto itself. And that leads to an important point here, which I always tell students. The student may well discover that after the first draft or second draft or third or fourth or something, the poem wants to go its own way in a different way, away from the original frame. And when that happens, that's what you got to do for the poem. Remember, the scaffold isn't the building. It's just something that helps you build the building. And that leads to another consideration. On the early drafts, though, it's important to have students give themselves over to the scaffold. Let it solve some of your expressive problems for you. One of the things that's difficult to show students when I'm teaching them how to write is that you can't, whenever you have a rule imposed, you can't look at that as a restriction, but as an opportunity. It makes a decision for you, thereby opening other possibilities, other decisions that you can make. Getting students to see that is important. And then finally, if you have trouble moving forward in some part of a poem, lower your standards. The words will come, and that's just good writing advice. So what I have found with giving students more creative writing opportunities, fewer interpretive papers, is that the students are able to use the poems that we study as a way of speaking to their conditions, sometimes powerfully. And the hymns are ripe for that, just the way that devotions is ripe for getting students to open up about what they're going through. So that's my bit. And with that, I will stop sharing, and we can move on to the next part of our deal.
I really want to thank you all. I could listen to it's late, but I could listen to you for a long time. But it's probably time to thank you all for this participation and the great questions and great discussion. And of course, I especially want to thank our excellent panelists, Michael and Mary and Sean, and also the technical and creative team, Arno, Brent, Greg, and Thea. Thank you so much for making this happen. Surely we seem to be able to create the true Donne Society spirit spanning over the globe and several time zones here. Thank you all for your support in making this a successful event. While I cannot wait to attend a real life conference again in the future, I'm happy to announce that there are 2 more webinars on the drawing board, and we will send out more information about those shortly. We are very much looking forward to seeing you there this winter. But now then, today, it's the 11th of December, or at least for most of us, it's still the 11th of December. And as Mary alluded, this brings us very close to St. Lucy's Day on the 13th. And while I'm talking to you from a time zone where I am close to midnight right now, in the middle of the darkness under the northern European sky, and I therefore feel especially close to what Donne may have experienced in his pre-industrial, pre-artificial light surroundings when writing the poem, I trust that we are all in our own ways in a place that right now feels like 'tis the year's midnight. We're all sharing the darkness of the current times. Yet this particular year, we are promised a glimpse of some cosmological magic in the coming weeks. The conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. These planets, while in actual fact far apart, still creating the illusion of a great double planet. This phenomenon is very symbolic for our webinar in these emergent occasions. While we are far apart, we can experience the technical virtual magic of being together, of talking about the scholarship and teaching that we love, and of being joined here in a moment of intellectual radiance that is larger than the sum of our individual lights shining far apart. I believe that this is the kind of moment of science meets magic that Donne would surely have appreciated. I want to wish you all happy holidays and a pleasant end of the year 2020, and my very best wishes for a very much better 2021. Thank you.